The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Direct us, O Lord, in all our doings, and with your most gracious favor, and further us with your continual help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in you, we may glorify your holy name, and finally, by your mercy, obtain everlasting life, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. We will continue today with our reflection on St. Benedict, and then of course next week we will not meet because we'll be blessing animals, and then there's some further interruptions. So after our treatment of St. Benedict today, we'll move on to other foundations of our faith. I do, however, want to commend, if you didn't go to church, Julia's sermon this morning. I thought it was brilliant. That's no surprise. Julia is brilliant. But I loved what she said. Those of us who have wrestled with theories of atonement over time, she gave you all you need to know. Jesus got into it so that we could get out of it. Next time somebody asks you about your atonement, substitution atonement or scapegoat atonement or whatever theory, you can just say, you know what I think? I think Jesus got into it so we could get out of it. It'll certainly make it a more interesting conversation. All right. The way of St. Benedict, I'm going to claim this morning, is an ancient answer to a modern question. An ancient answer to a modern question. First, I want to review the roots of the rule itself and monasticism, and because I think that's critical to how we see the rule of St. Benedict working its way into the tradition of the Episcopal Church. But then I want to take a modern day example and explore what I believe to be the contemporaneous energy of the rule of St. Benedict and how you might think about it outside of the walls of a monastery. So the way of St. Benedict, an ancient answer to a modern question. First, Anthony the Great. You will remember that at the end of the 3rd century, Anthony, the eldest son, in fact, of a wealthy Christian family, denounces his inheritance, actually providing for his sister, moves into the desert in order to draw closer to God. He does all of this in response to hearing the passage from Matthew that says, give away all that you have and go and be with the poor. He taught, notwithstanding this search for solitude, that gaining the brother and sister and winning God are linked. In other words, all of his solitude and all of his focus and all of his desire for purity was for the purpose of his neighbor. Not just so he could draw closer to God, but so that he wouldn't get in the way of their relationship with God. And this distinction, which I think is not always made when we think about the desert mothers and fathers, I want to continually remind you of. Our kind of movement into liberal theology, whether we know it or not, with its individualism and focus on self and the salvation of self, sometimes causes us to forget that we are called into a process of learning to shape our lives like that of Jesus for the sake of others. It's not primarily even for our own salvation that we pursue the intimacy of this relationship. And that distinction is made by Anthony the Great all the way back in the beginning of the desert movement. So I might say Anthony is the seed of the desert. Evagrius Ponticus, who was another wealthy patrician, highly educated, very intelligent, is actually more associated with the East. I bring him up because his influence over Cassian and Benedict allows him to be felt in the West, but he's really more of an Eastern father. He was the one who really introduced more sophisticated psychology into the spirituality of the desert. He was the originator of the 8 evil thoughts. You might not have heard much about the 8 evil thoughts, but you probably have heard a lot about Gregory the Great's adoption of them, making them the 7 deadly sins. Those things called the 7 deadly sins, which again, I think have been misinterpreted in the Western Protestant tradition. And that's why we spent so much time on Elizabeth Oldfield's book, Being Fully Alive, where we went back and looked at the definition of sin, not as a moral failing, but as an impediment to relationship. You remember that move that she makes? That's totally in keeping with the Desert Mothers and Fathers. It is, in fact, where she gets it from. She is a student of Rowan Williams, who you know is a student of the Eastern Fathers, and it is out of that movement that she gets this understanding of sin. But it's not an isolated interpretation. It is, I think, at the foundation of Anglican spirituality. So when we say, what does it mean to be an Episcopalian? What we're talking about is who we really are in our relationship with God and each other. And that understanding of sin is core to the development of that person. It is Evagrius who charts out stages of spiritual growth. We subsequently get a number of systems, Teresa, John of the Cross. There are all kinds of different systems. These are the 4 or 5 stages. This is particularly popular among mystical writers. The challenge we tend to face is that most of them are describing something that can't really be fully understood. So they're using terminology that we don't get. If you haven't experienced that thing, you're not going to know what they're talking about. It's not like if they're saying first a chair, then a door, then the outside pavement, where those items are things that we recognize and have experience with. Instead, they're talking about going deeper and deeper into a relationship with God, using words or images or metaphors to describe them. Teresa of Avila famously uses working her way through a garden. They can be helpful and interesting, but I, at least, the first time I read them, I find them to be obscure and unhelpful and humiliating. Right? But as you, through your prayer and growth, start to have those experiences, a loss of self, a sense of what instrumentality really means, how to feel more for somebody else than you do for yourself, or how to be fully empathetic in the sufferings of another, then you go back and you go, oh, that's what she's talking about when she's talking about flowing water, right? So they're wonderful writings to have, but they don't always serve as perfect guides to how we ought to grow in our relationship with God. But they're helpful guides because if you find somebody, so for me it's the Rhineland mystics, so Meister Eckhart and Hildegard, who make the most sense. Teresa is wonderful, John of the Cross is wonderful, but they don't resonate with me the way Eckhart does. I don't know why, probably because he stays in his head all the time. But nevertheless, read through the mystics and you will find somebody whose vocabulary, whose path seems to look more like your own. Nobody is saying this is the only way to do it. They're simply writing down what they've experienced, often over their entire lives, in order to guide those who follow. Typically, they're writing it down because they've been asked to write it down. You know, it's like you have lived such an exemplary life. You clearly have a connection with God that we would love to participate in. Please write that down. If I had to choose a mystic to represent the Anglican tradition, what it means to be an Episcopalian, it would clearly be Julian of Norwich, right? Julian of Norwich, who has on her deathbed this experience of Christ and spends the next 38 years locked away, sheltering in place, you might say, trying to figure out what it all means. She writes down the showings immediately. Now, she's in Norwich, which is a port city in England at the end of the 14th century. You will remember that Europe loses almost half its population in the 14th century because of the Black Plague. So when I say sheltering place, I'm not kidding, right? But there she sat with one window onto the world and the other window into the church so she could see the Eucharist being celebrated and participate in it. And people came to see her for her wisdom, and she gradually refined her writings. But for the 14th century, for example, Her artful and orthodox use of the feminine for God is amazingly ahead of its time, right? Her understanding of what it means for Jesus to be present with us is amazingly ahead of its time. And yet it was accepted because of its wisdom and insight, and it still guides a lot of how we might interpret things like atonement theology much differently than Protestant denominations, and even more differently than the Roman Catholic tradition. Although it's very difficult, I think, to characterize the Roman Catholic tradition as if it's one thing. Because which is kind of fascinating, right? Given this hierarchical structure where the Pope can issue statements that are deemed to be from God and without dispute, the truth is the Roman Catholic tradition serves as this huge tent, which includes everything from very fundamentalist parish priest to these liberal religious, right? Richard Rohr is nobody's literalist, right? All of those folks are finding their nurture in the Roman Catholic tradition. They're all drinking from the well of that spirituality. So you might say that Evagrius is the map of the inner life, which brings us to John Cassian, who I've described as the bridge to the West. Cassian lived with the Desert Fathers, so absorbing both Evagrius, but also being taught by the others that were there. All of this is, with Anthony the Great's kind of wisdom. It's permeating everything everyone else is saying. But he then writes down a lot of what he has experienced. His books are called The Institutes and The Conferences, and they're still in print today, primarily because Benedict prescribed the conferences to be read by all of his monks. So Cassian, with Benedict, is one of those that I've marked as moving that transition out of the desert and into the Western world. Cassian emphasizes purity of heart, unceasing prayer, and a balance of grace and effort. I'm hoping just as I read those words, they resonate with you, because I think we talk that way all the time, right? Our own idea of what purity of heart means, trying to achieve a balance in life and focus on prayer. As I mentioned, this was a profound influence on Benedict. So while Cassian was a bridge to the West, it was Benedict who actually sat down and wrote the rule for the community. Augustine, as I mentioned last time, had a rule, very loose interpretation, kind of a vision more than practical guidelines. And Cassian too had a very short rule, but it was Benedict who took all of life and put it into this rule. The rule has a couple of elements to it that we think of all the time. One is called ora et labora. Have you ever heard this phrase, ora et labora? Ora et labora. Anybody know Cynthia Bourgeault? Have you read Cynthia Bourgeault? This is a huge part of her spirituality or retreats. You can't go on a retreat with Cynthia Bourgeault without going out to build something, clean something, or paint something. It's all part of her embodiment of Benedictine spirituality. We're to engage our bodies and not just get locked away in our minds is a necessary element to being alive. We're out in the world, right? I sometimes think this is not a bad parallel for our sense that we have to hike or fish or hunt or whatever just to get outside, just to be in the world and move. It's a different way of experiencing the world. There was an old show, it might have been Maxwell Smart, I can't remember, but it was in that era. And they always have the most creative evil guys in those old shows. And one evil genius was this guy in a wheelchair. Anybody remember this? And he was in a wheelchair not because he was crippled, but because he had decided that any energy that went to his body was wasted. And he wanted all of the energy that he was in control of to be available to his mind. It was all about his mind, which is not a bad kind of metaphor for what's wrong with the Enlightenment, right? What happened when we got fascinated with logic and intellectual analysis and rationality to the exclusion of things that can't quite be measured as easily. Heart, compassion, intuition, imagination, creativity. Those things are not just coming out of our analytical mind. I'll never forget that character. Or et labora, stability, obedience, and conversion of life, and community as a school of love. The key thing about the rule of St. Benedict is its focus on community. So I want you to be able to see how that focus on community wasn't new. It may have been implemented in a genius way, but it is rooted in and drawing upon the fundamental wisdom of the desert mothers and fathers. Can you see that thread? Because if not, we're going to repeat all of last week's. No, I'm just kidding. I want you to see that thread because it's fighting against the idea that your religion is a private matter, that your faith is a private matter, that it's just between you and God. Do what works for you. Anything that seems okay with you is okay. That may be fine that's called the principle of neutrality. And it may be fine when we're talking about what laws the government ought to have. But when we're talking about how we work out our faith, that's not what we believe at all. We believe that our faith is worked out in community. That when we gain a brother or a sister, we are winning God and vice versa. When Jesus offers the summary of the law, you remember what he says? The first commandment is, love your Lord your God with all your mind, heart, strength. The second is love your neighbor as yourself. That English phrase, and the second is like it, can also be, and I would rather it be interpreted, translated as another way of saying that is. Do you see the difference? We have it in our minds from right one, right? And the second is like it. There are two commandments, the summary of the law. We know that. But what if there's really only one commandment, stated two different ways? So I maintain that you can't draw closer to God without drawing closer to your neighbor. And you cannot draw closer to your neighbor without drawing closer to God. You may not call it that, but they are linked because God is present in our neighbor, right? Does anybody not see that? You don't have to agree with it. But do you not see that? And one way of testing whether you see it is, did you always think that to be true, or did you think those were separate things? So that we could go in our rooms and draw closer to God and not have to worry about that annoying neighbor. Remember what we talked about last time is that kind of sense that if those other people would just go away, everything would be okay, right? Which, most of us are old enough to know, like, no, that's never true. Somebody else always emerges. Part of the idea of stability in the rule of St. Benedict is to remain in community. To remain in community. I remember a priest, she was the rector of Epiphany, a wonderful priest and a graduate of the great university in Chapel Hill. And she had somebody come, she came to me one time, she said, oh my God, this person that came to church, they were X, Y, and Z. And I thought, oh, please, 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 do not come here, because then I'll have to love you. Right? So a great practical application of what I'm talking about. My duty is to love you. If I am proximate to you, then I must love you. So please go somewhere else where somebody else can love you. I'm sure you'll be more appealing to the people down the road. You seem like a Baptist to me, actually. There's another great story of a former rector of St. Bart's who famously went down to Peoplestown, which is where Turnerfield used to be, and started Emmaus House, where some of you know I was for a while. And his name was Austin Ford, and he got down there in the middle of the 60s and jumped right into the civil rights movement. Austin was a brilliant iconoclast. So the story, which I verified when he was at St. Bart's, is that some parishioner came and said they thought he was doing something wrong and he needed to do it differently. I know what it was, but I'm not going to burden you with the details. And he looked at them. And then the next Sunday he went up to them and he said, I just want you to know I've transferred you to St. Luke's. True story. True story. Right. At least he took his obligation to care and love those in front of him seriously. He just got rid of them altogether. So this idea of community and stability is hard, right? It's hard. And the way it works itself out in our lives is not just in the confines of the cathedral. It should, but it's also in our willingness to be encountering others. So Brian Stevenson calls it being proximate to others. Do you know who Brian Stevenson is? Brilliant civil rights advocate, lawyer, and has done really, really great work. Not just by screaming at people about how wrong they are or calling them names, but by finding ways for people to be proximate to each other, by finding ways for people to engage and encounter each other while still telling the truth. It's one of the brilliant things he's done, I think. And what comes out of his seminars, I mean, there's one practice, so John, help me with this, but they've identified what are known as lynching trees across parts of maybe Alabama. So the pilgrimage that you take is you go down to the museum, and where's that, Montgomery? You go to Montgomery, and then they send you out to one of the lynching trees where you say prayers or honor that spot in whatever way you feel is appropriate, and then scoop up some sand or dirt from that spot, which is now deemed to be sacred by your own experience, and bring it back, and maybe you deposit it in the museum and have it on the wall, I don't know. But the point I'm trying to make is just being in that spot and digging in the dirt there while you're in prayer has been transformative to people, right? Transformative to people. They're not giving you any real history beyond some sketch of why you're there. They're not, right, attacking you about anything. They're giving you an opportunity to be open to what happened on a very personal level. And the stories that people tell coming back are nothing short of testimonies. They are witnesses to the presence of God in the suffering of that place. And so we're not having fights about who's responsible for it. The people that are there feel responsible for it as they learn to participate in it. Do you see that? You see how powerful that is? Just being proximate to this symbol with an open heart. That's all he's asking you to do. And what happens is what, in the rule of St. Benedict, we might call conversion of life. Why? Because we're not in that spot fighting to assert ourselves or distance ourselves or defend ourselves or blame somebody else. It's not about being angry. It's not about being culpable. It's about being present. It's about being present. Because only when you're present can that spot speak to you. So Brian Stevenson, outside of church, but nevertheless following a liturgical pattern, has found a way for those willing to participate to enter into this sacred moment and be resonant with it. Now, what you do with that change, he's not prescribing, right? But you walk away a changed person, which is what pilgrimage is all about. All of that is part and parcel of what the rule of Benedict is trying to say, to be proximate to. And the fundamental idea of the rule of being with, whatever it is, stability, stability, poverty, and chastity are the basic monastic values which get worked out in the rule of St. Benedict. There's a great story of a man who was thinking about becoming a monk, and he went to one of the Carmelite monasteries out in California, which you may know is located up on this beautiful ridge. And so they were explaining these vows. And they took him up to this gorgeous view over the Pacific Ocean, and you're up at 10,000 feet, and the desert's on one side, and the gorgeous valleys are on the other side. And the guy said his breath was taken away, just completely taken away. And he looked at the abbot who was guiding him, and he said, I got to tell you, if this is poverty, I can't wait to see chastity. I'll let you ruminate on that for a minute. Yeah. All right. What St. Benedict does, however, is take this learning and put it into a form where it can be lived out. That's the value of the rule, really. Take the learning, put it in a form where it can be lived out. And my claim to you is when we say, what does it mean to be an Episcopalian? It is, in fact, a living out of that form of life. When we say a Christian way of life in the Episcopal Church, this is what we're talking about. Not necessarily cognitive assent to the propositional statements and in a bunch of creeds. We do that too, but not because they stand on their own, but because they serve as guides to a way of life. What we're committing to is not, we think this is the truth and I'll defend it to the death. That's not what it means to be a Christian in the way we conceive it. It is, I'm committing to a way of life where I will continue to grow in my relationship with God and to do it with you. And we're going to use these guidelines for our journey. That's what it means to be an Episcopalian. So we have ethics, but we don't start there. We have outreach, but we don't start there. We engage in social justice, but we don't start there. Where do we start? Prayer. We start in prayer, because by the time we get to those questions, those challenges, those encounters, we want to be a certain kind of person. We want to be a certain kind of person. We want our doing to come out of our being. So in summary, you might say that Anthony planted the seed of radical solitude. Evagrius mapped the inner journey. Cassian carried the seed westward and replanted it. Aren't you impressed with this extended metaphor I got going here? Benedict then built the garden wall and gave it order so it could grow for centuries. I want you, when you're thinking about what it means to be an Episcopalian, to have a sense that your roots go back to the desert mothers and fathers, and back further than that to Christ, right? And that's part of who we are, part of the journey that we are on. Who founded the Episcopal Church? Thank you, okay. All right, so let's take all this and give it a more practical application. What does all that mean? Because I've said repeatedly, the desert mothers and fathers didn't want to escape a society in the sense of not being part of it, not having to deal with it. They wanted to escape the social dynamics of the urban areas where they were in order to be quiet and still so they could be in relationship with God in a different way. They wound up forming their own communities, and people invariably wound up going back to the city. So that leaves us with the question, why democracy? It's not a question really, I'm just going to make the statement. Why democracy needs the rule of St. Benedict. I'm intended to be provocative here, right? If there's one thing everybody can agree on is that our democracy is being challenged. So I'm playing off of that. I'm not going to make a partisan political comment after this. I'm just saying, as we be different people, how would we engage something as contemporary and modern as our perceived challenge to democracy? To do that, I want to go back and start with a guy named Erich Fromm. He's a German psychologist, born in 1900. As you can imagine, then he went through as the German experience of World War I, German experience of World War II, and was still around in the 60s to be writing. And what he became fascinated by, just to make this point quickly, I didn't understand this till I got to seminary, but by the time the Holocaust happens, Germany is the center of civilization in the Western world. It is where the top, most sophisticated theology is being articulated. It is where the deepest and most sophisticated philosophy is being practiced. It is where the burgeoning area of psychology is actually being nurtured, right? All this is happening in Germany. And yet Germany is the place where the Holocaust happens. So a lot of the rest, I think, of the 20th century and 21st century in a more attenuated way is trying to deal with that. How is it that the best of us, as we conceived it, got it so wrong? Got it so wrong. Some of that movement is simply a throwing off of anything German, right? And I don't mean you can't drive a BMW or Mercedes, although that used to be a thing too. I just mean we kind of dismiss the German thinking as being somehow wrong, overly systematic, overly analytical. When the truth is, the Germans have also done, truth from my perspective is, the Germans have also done a superb job of trying to wrestle with that. The same way I think some of the best anti-racist thought comes out of the South, right? Comes out of the South, in my view. All right. So, he wrote a number of books, all exploring themes of freedom, love, and human flourishing. But in the mid-70s, he wrote a seminal text called To Have or To Be. Do you know this work, To Have or To Be? You do, but I want to know if you know it. Because the distinction he makes between having and being is one that we talk about, although not always in these terms, but it also pervades a number of other kind of theological and philosophical and psychological constructs that you're familiar with. Having means simply defining life by possessions, control, and consumption. Something I can use, right? That's what it means to have, something I can use. I can instrumentalize it. It's for my benefit. Being, then, is defining life by aliveness, shared experience, and authentic presence. Now, I've set them up here as if they're kind of mutually exclusive things. Having is bad and being is good, and you just want to be. That, of course, is not true. It may be helpful for conversation, but the truth is, you've got to mix the two of them. The question is, what do you give priority to, and when do you act in one mode, and when do you act in the other? It's a question of discernment, not avoidance, but discernment. And discernment throws you right back into the rule of St. Benedict, because the biggest element of discernment, the way we think of it in the church, that's not just making a decision, it's literally going through a process of trying to decide what God wants you to do. The biggest element of that is you. And you don't just write out a list of pluses and minuses and balance it up at the end as if it's a calculus equation, and the trick is making sure all the variables are accounted for. That can be part of it. But it's a much deeper process of preparing yourself to enter into it, going through all those other analytical, logistical processes, and then confirming it somehow in prayer. You don't want to lose the being part. Martin Buber, the great German philosopher, I call him a theologian, in I and Thou, are you familiar with this work? He talks about relationships we have with others, whether we treat another as an I, as a subject, as another person worthy of dignity, as their own being, or whether we treat them as an object, right? So when we get to, say, feminist thought or any other thought that follows that pattern, where the complaint is that a certain person or group is being objectified, this is what they're talking about. That in the relationships of power, they are the it in the relationship. They're treated like an object, not a person that has their own rights, but an it to be utilized for the benefit of the I, right? So not to look at this just socially or politically, back when we used to have cocktail parties, I don't know that people do that anymore. You don't go to the office, but we used to have cocktail parties, and it was a real core part of building your practice or engaging in whatever community you were in. So one little exercise I developed when I was at cocktail parties as a young lawyer was, how long can I go without anybody asking, without my having to say anything about myself? You with me? How long? Somebody say, what do you do? And I said, probably not much dissimilar from you. What do you do? Oh, well, let me tell you. Right? Or I distinctly remember sitting at a cocktail party and realizing that the person I was talking to was done with me. They'd figured out that I wasn't worth their time, and they were looking over their shoulder to figure out who could. Now, part of this is totally excusable, right? You didn't go to the cocktail party to be tidily. You're trying to build your practice. I get it. But what happens is that way of being, developed for perhaps a reasonable purpose in one context, winds up leaking over into others. And so I don't want you to go into cathedral cocktail parties playing this game, because I don't want you to be successful at it. I do want you to be aware when you do it, right? When was, no show of hands here, so you feel what you feel. When was the last time you walked into a room and you looked around and everybody you thought you wanted to sit with was already seated at a table with no empty seats? But there was somebody you didn't know or weren't particularly interested in or knew weren't going to have anything interesting to say who's sitting over there. I don't want to know what you did. I want you to think about how you felt in that moment. Did you go over with eager anticipation about learning something totally new and interesting about somebody you didn't know anything about, who probably didn't share a lot of your life? Or did you think, well, let me go make the best of this. When I get up to go get dessert, then I can move to another table, right? We think of this, or I think of this in the kind of paradigmatic example of the nerd back at school who sat at a lunch table nobody sat with, right? But you can come up with more sophisticated manifestations of that in your own life. And all I'm saying is use it as a tool to assess where you are on this issue. You don't have to report to anybody and decide if that's who you want to be. One of the things I loved about my mother, who could make her way around the most sophisticated of context, but she loved to get on a city bus and find somebody she didn't know and talk to. I mean, it was the bane of my childhood, because I knew once we got on that bus, we weren't going to get off at our stop because Mom would be engaged in some. At any rate, there's a wonderful example that Elizabeth Oldfield tells in her book. Do you remember when she's going to her stop in her integrating neighborhood in London, and she gets crosswise with this African-American matriarch there, and they're just, this whole story is exactly that. So if you don't know that story, come tell me, I'll tell it to you again. But it's a wonderful story. And then Elizabeth Oldfield, who, by the way, will be our spirituality speaker in 26, right? We got Padraig coming soon, but we booked Elizabeth for the subsequent thing, which I'm really excited about. But she caught herself. She goes, oh, I know what I'm doing here. I'm just playing all these tapes, right? And so this is a practice she called, Can We Start Again? Which I will just confess we implement in our household a lot. And so she just looked at this woman who'd been mad at her because she had used a seat for her child. Not an offense in most cultures. Nevertheless, she looked at this woman, she said, can we just start again? And the woman paused and said, yes, okay. And so they started again. And then the story ends with somebody else getting on the bus, yelling and screaming at Elizabeth Oldfield, and this woman standing up for her in a very profound way. Is it I it or I you? The other place we've encountered this is with Ian McGilchrist. Do you remember? I know I belabored his hemispheric hypothesis for a long time. Thank you for enduring that. But he is the British polymath who went back and articulated a hypothesis that your right hemisphere of your brain and your left hemisphere of your brain are actually, while in most ways the same, focused on different tasks. So not left brain, right brain, one does one thing, one does the other. This is more modern than that. But the right brain is the one that sees connections and is imaginative and sees the horizon, whereas the left brain is that which is constantly discarding things in an effort to get to what's right, to get to the action that needs to be taken, the decision that needs to be made. And McGilchrist's claim is that in Western civilization, we have become so proficient in using our left brain that we think that's all there is. And we have lost our ability to access our right brain. When the truth, according to McGilchrist, is we should actually start in our left brain, delegate tasks to our left brain, and go back to the right brain. Sound a lot like the discernment process that I mentioned, right? Now, to be clear, your left brain, that analytical, getting to the point, discarding what isn't relevant, it controls the right side of your body, right? Your right hand. Whereas your right brain controls the left side of your body or your left hand. Most of us, those who aren't closer to God, are right-handed. Right? That's our power, that's our control, that's the way we assert ourselves in the world. If we're there with our left hand, it's a different way of being. I had nerve damage in my right hand and lost the use of it for a couple of months. And I had to learn to write with my left hand. Oh my God, it was like a 2-year-old, right? But humility came much more naturally during that period of time than it did before. So whether it's having or being from, I, you, I, it from Buber, right brain, left brain from McGilchrist, do you see that it's the same thing? They're different modes of being. The trick is to integrate them in ways that let us be the most we can be. And the danger is that we default to the ones that promise the most control, that seem to be the most helpful in defending ourselves against threats. But in doing so, we miss out on the ability to be in relationship. The Anglican consciousness, particularly as described by Urban Holmes, who was the famous dean up at Swanee for a while, is a left-handed spirituality. A left-handed spirituality. What is he saying? He's saying that it's not dominated by I, it. It's not dominated by having. It's not dominated by the left brain. It starts and ends with an openness, an imagination, a creativity. It's fundamentally a right brain controlled consciousness. All right. So the person that I want to cover is this fascinating sociologist, so another German, and he's written several books, but he's got this really sophisticated kind of diagnosis of our social problems. And quickly it's that we're forever accelerating. Things are just going faster and faster and faster. And part of that increased speed is the demand for growth, right? The demand for growth. And so we're constantly dedicating ourselves to that, fearing the lack of it. This is in business, but it's also personal. And as we have become more oppressed by this need for growth, we then become more aggressive in the way we engage the world and ourselves and other people. As we become more and more aggressive, we perhaps predictably become more and more alienated. Because, he says, we're in the having mode. It turns out that what Rosa did was read about 10 pages in Fromm, and he's expanded that to about 1,000 pages over 3 books. And it's a brilliant kind of manifestation of the having way of being. And he's ascribing that. He's German. It's not like he's German born, but operating out of Chicago or something. He's primarily still in Europe. So his examples are often European examples. It's not just a US-based insight. But in his last book, Democracy Needs Religion, he says, or argues anyway, that he spent all this time figuring out what was wrong, i.e. the alienation that came from the acceleration, and this idea that we're just frantically pedaling harder and harder and harder, not going anywhere. And our kids don't think they're going to have it as good as we did. I, by the way, will just say I'm not sure that's true, but that's for another day maybe. They're persuaded, my kids are, maybe your kids are too, that they're just not going to enjoy as much freedom, not going to earn as much money, not going to have as many, whatever. The world's not going to offer them the same kind of vocational path. And what Harmoot, M-O-O-T, is how you pronounce it, says, is that I did all this work figuring all this out and wrote all these books, and I looked around and I realized that all the practices we need to combat this are actually in religion. And not just Christianity, but he doesn't say this necessarily, he doesn't say it at all. But what he means is the contemplative dimensions of religion. So we might call it good religion or mystical religion. But it's religion that engages a way of being that draws us into closer relationship with God. Not a religion dedicated to protecting its boundaries and denominating others as bad and all that kind of stuff. That's bad religion, if you will, which pervades all denominations. Nobody's free of this. But good religion, the contemplative religion, that which is focused on your relationship with God and each other. And so he comes to, we're going to have to end before I'm through with this, so I'll give you, at the end, the point is there are a bunch of practices in the Rule of St. Benedict that help this. There, 15 minutes, we're not going to cover that. Because what I found fascinating about his work is his concept of resonance. His concept of resonance, and so I'm just going to end here. But in the concept of resonance, and so I've given you a picture of a string quartet. There is a cello, in fact, tucked away just off screen. And because to me, that is a wonderful manifestation of resonance, right? A string that's vibrating when it's triggered, touched, influenced by an outside force. And of course, we also remember the science experiment with the tuning forks are set up and you hit one and over time the other one starts to vibrate as well. Resonance. But the point is, for that resonance to occur, you've got to allow yourself to be affected. If you armor yourself up against any kind of penetration so that you're not touched by another person or another event or an experience, then you're not going to resonate with that experience. You're safe, but alone, alienated. This is what happens when we're on our phones, right? Or when we don't engage other people, or all the other ways that our social dynamics have us separated from each other at an accelerated pace. As you move further along the algorithm, you're going to become less and less connected with other people, less and less available to be affected, at least in the way we're talking about. And pretty soon you just kind of lose touch of everything. It just strikes me as odd that we don't know what to eat. Have you ever thought about this? Are you supposed to eat fat or not eat fat? Are carbs good or bad for you? Should you be eating 23 meals of very small all day to keep your blood sugar up, or fasting for 12 hours at a time? I defy you to figure out which one of those is the universally accepted, scientifically proven way to eat. So, what's the biggest thing in the market right now? Shots. I don't have time. We can talk later, but let me get through this. Yeah, so now what's these shots that allow you to lose weight? It's kind of like a miracle, really, right? But somehow what it does is diffuse your appetite. So what are food manufacturers doing with their processed foods? Injecting elements into them that actually adversely affect the satiation response you would naturally have. So on the one hand, we're putting things in our body that affect our appetite by diminishing it, while at the other hand, we're buying stuff off the shelf, which is affecting our appetite by decreasing our ability to diminish it. All of this is going on all the time. I don't mean to hold out anybody as being evil. You just look around, all this stuff is going on. We think we make our own decisions, but the truth is, do we really make our own decisions? I think I've told you the story about going to the Ansley Country Club for a meeting, and it was a meeting of Episcopal priests, and I was there in my penny loafers and charcoal gray pants with a houndstooth jacket and a black shirt and a white collar with a collar set. And as I was walking up the steps to this meeting, a Jewish friend of mine came out. She'd just finished playing golf, and she looked at me, and she just had the most exasperated look, and she said, "Do they make you guys dress that way?" And I didn't realize what she was even talking about. And then when I got back to the room where the meeting was, I was going, oh, of course. It's like we're all off of, some London haberdasher. Here we are. So how much do we really make our own decisions? Anyway, the first aspect of resonance, you got to be affected. If you're affected, then you respond. And this is the beautiful part, where something in you naturally responds. So think about listening to music. If you go to a symphony and you're worried about your children or what the emails that you're not getting but might be missing, then you may not even hear the wonderful presentation. But if you open yourself to it, then you respond to it, then you feel differently, right? Another part of you has been activated. That's, I think, what we're talking about in religious vocabulary is transformation. You become a different person because of your experience. And you have a sense of agency, so then you begin to act that out. That's what it means to resonate. And so what the rule of St. Benedict is doing is trying to put you into a position where you can resonate with life, whether it's another person or a tree or a circumstance, whether that's good or bad, painful or pleasurable. How can you be in it all? And it's those practices, I think, which create a consciousness we think of as Anglican and allows us to be what we think of as Episcopalian. All right, I've got another 30 minutes here. That's what happens. I hope this is helpful because we'll move on past the rule of St. Benedict. If you have more specific questions, I'm happy to answer them. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.